first way we confront white supremacy is by naming it what it is. It is a sin. White supremacy is idolatry. God revealed God's self at Sinai, saying, I am the Lord your God who has taken you out of the land of Mitzrayim, the house of bondage. This was our introduction. God revealed God's self by saying, oppression will not stand, racism will not stand. The very next word that God revealed was, you shall have no other gods besides me. You shall not have idols. What is an idol? Abraham Joshua Heschel taught, what is an idol? Any God who is mine but not yours. Any God concerned with me but not you is an idol. So first of all, we understand and proclaim that white supremacy is idolatry. All other sins proceed from this original sin. The idolatry that is white supremacy sanctions that I need not care about people who are of a different race, a different religion, a different ethnicity. That I need not care about those who are incarcerated, those who are poor, those who are working for a minimum wage. The idolatry of white supremacy, which claims that God is concerned with me but not with you, also justifies the abomination of having billionaires and at the same time people living on the street, in the same city, in our city.
We are so much more than what divides us, and that together we can overcome any obstacle that we face, even from the highest offices in the land. In February of 1964, the Metropolitan Conference on Race and Religion, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel stood before a crowd and shared that while Pharaoh's troops drowned in the sea, Pharaoh lives on. And we are here today because we know that Pharaoh indeed lives on. Pharaoh lives in the White House. Pharaoh lives in the Senate building. Pharaoh lives in all offices of power, in all of the corridors that hold the keys that somehow have locked out so many people from a life of freedom and prosperity and justice. So we thank you for gathering us today in this special place, in this holy space, in Holman United Methodist Church, which has brought together so many gatherings to fight against gun violence, to fight against racial oppression, to fight against racial terror, to bring communities and faith groups together in order to learn that we can stand together even in the most difficult moments. Thank you for reminding us that even now, as once again it has become clear to us just where Pharaoh stands, that we can rise together to fight any kind of oppression and injustice in brotherhood and in sisterhood and in peace.
Well, it was in 1619 that we as a people found ourselves in Jamestown, Virginia, and out of that grew the phenomenon of the slave experience we underwent on these shores. And yet, in the midst of that experience, we were sustained by our understanding of who God is. That understanding evolved in terms of Christian understanding, but it was an understanding of the divine that sustained us, notwithstanding those who viewed us as chattel property. And so we have a commonality of theological understanding that informs our identity as persons of Jewish heritage and persons of African heritage.
I share this story today because we all know that there is a great pain that is plaguing America today. With every lie, with every bit of racist incitement, with every anti-Semitic canard tweeted from the highest offices in our land, we are nearly brought to our knees with shock and pain. But that pain is not what threatens to kill us. Rambam, Maimonides, the great medieval Jewish scholar who was both a Torah scholar and a medical doctor, taught that before treating an illness, it is essential that we first be very careful to establish a proper diagnosis, because some illnesses require nothing more than a few days of rest, while others require invasive treatments and dangerous, even sometimes life-threatening surgeries. This is also the case, Rambam taught, with spiritual sicknesses. It's only when we take the time to properly diagnose what is ailing the body and the soul that we will have a chance at healing. That is true, he said, for each of us individually, and it is true for all of us collectively as a nation. So today I want for us to be honest about what we see when we examine the body of our nation. Yes, there is a great and awful pain in the gut. It is the pain of polarization and division. It is the ache of cruelty and incivility. It's the pain of willful lies and reckless endangerment of democratic norms. It is the pain of needless and ceaseless efforts to affront every single thing we know to be just and right. It is the pain that led my husband and me to sit down the morning after the 2016 elections and say to our children, you must remember that bullies and cheaters and liars may win in the short term, but they do not in the end win. From this point forward, we must turn this house into an oasis of love and justice. As the world gets more hateful, more dishonest, and more dangerous, we must become even better versions of ourselves, more patient, more compassionate, more loving. Because in the end, it is only love that wins. And my kids were incredibly kind to each other for about 10 minutes that morning, which I considered a great parental achievement. The pain that we feel as a country today is real, but those most flagrant symptoms are only a hint of what is actually threatening our lives, our democracy, and the planet. It's important that we understand that, because at some point the pain in the gut will go away, whether by impeachment or by election. And when it does, we will all breathe a sigh of relief. We will be more than ready to go back to business as usual. But our problems will not be solved unless and until we rout out the real sickness in the body, which is not only at the top but permeates every single part of our collective system. The body of our country is now on the examination table. And when we really look, we see that a cancer has wrapped itself around the spine of our nation. It is the cancer of white supremacy, a disease that has festered and metastasized at the heart of our nation from its founding. It has demonized, dehumanized, demoralized, and disenfranchised millions of people over hundreds of years. Its toxicity knows no bounds. And most egregiously, the cancer of white supremacy has triumphed under the banner of religion. Today in Washington, D.C., you can see a slave Bible. Thank you. You can see a slave Bible on display in the Museum of the Bible. It was published in 1807, designed for use in worship by enslaved people in the British West Indies. The slave Bible was edited by slaveholders to exclude any reference to the Exodus from Egypt, which the slaveholders knew might incite rebellion. Imagine a Bible with no Pharaoh, with no Moses, with no burning bush, with no Sinai. From the beginning, religion has been used as a primary justification for slavery, which was described as an institution of God, as part of the natural order of the universe. Preachers would get up and speak on Sunday morning of the theological underpinnings of slavery, arguing that enslaved people were inferior beings, that they were not fully human, that they were people who would be worse off without the institution of slavery, both to discipline and to feed them. Religious leaders and religious communities played a significant role not only in the justification of slavery and racial segregation, but in the reign of racial terror that followed Reconstruction and led to the Civil Rights Movement. While there were many cases that we know of in which ministers risked their lives to support the anti-lynching movement, there were also many cases in which justification for lynching came directly from church leaders themselves. Ta-Nehisi Coates points out that in his famous Segregation Now speech, George Wallace invoked God's name nearly 30 times and calls the federal government opposing him a system that is the very opposite of Christ, language that we hear echoes of today. Unfortunately, that very same white supremacist theology is still alive and well in our time. Pastor Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, a pastor in North Carolina, now argues that slaveholder religion would like us to stay focused on personal piety and compassion ministries, to not be too political, something that I myself hear all too often from many of my colleagues in the rabbinate, and some of my friends and colleagues here can attest to that as well. Pastor Wilson Hartgrove identifies, quote, the silence of white moderates as a vestige of slaveholder religion, end quote. And that, my friends, is a sin that is perpetrated not only by many in the church, but also by many in the synagogue as well. Our religious institutions have become shields defending the indefensible. Today, we see faith leaders not only giddily lining up to lay hands on a person who engages in decidedly irreligious personal behavior, whether it's bragging about sexual assault or paying off porn stars or not paying contracted workers or lying or cheating or stealing. But those very same religious leaders are also working overtime to bring harm to the least of these, to the poor, to the widow, to the orphan, and to the stranger. America today is drowning in bad religion. And bad religion fuels and is fueled by the cancer of white supremacy, now again erupting in the public square. In America, as we know, there has been a significant rise in hate crimes related to race, ethnicity, religion, and sexuality over the past 3 to 4 years, much of which can be attributed to this resurgent white supremacist movement. The rise in anti-Semitism, which Dr. Cohen alluded to earlier, manifesting most terrifyingly in the massacres in Pittsburgh and Poway, corresponds to this broader trend. I want to be clear that all manifestations of anti-Semitism are dangerous, even when they come from among our allies. But it is important that we are clear that the people who have engaged in murderous acts of violence against Jews in this country and those who pose the greatest threat to our people are all white nationalist terrorists whose goal is nothing short of the eradication of Jews and people of color from this country. These white nationalists abide a particular brand of anti-Semitism that was honed over centuries in Europe and has now successfully migrated to the United States. This is a right-wing, nationalistic anti-Semitism in which Jews, the ultimate outsiders, conspire to commit a white genocide by undermining systems of white power through funding and supporting people of color and movements for social change. Over the past few years, America has turned from a place with a constant but quiet undercurrent of this anti-Semitic white nationalism to a place in which anti-Semitism and racism are fed, fueled, and funded from the highest offices in the land. Conspiracy theories of globalists manipulating the economy and cheating American workers have permeated the consciousness of a generation of angry, disaffected white men who were looking for scapegoats and have now been handed yet another one. So here's the irony. Good religion stems from precisely the same biblical narrative that the white supremacists used to justify their bad religion. Those sections that were excised from the slave Bible form the core narrative, the meta-narrative that is at the heart of our faith. Activists from abolitionists to civil rights leaders were often people of faith, whose belief in God and whose reading of the Bible compelled them to resist the norms of slaveholder religion and affirm the sanctity of all human life and the dignity of all of God's children. The core story of my faith is a redemption story, the story of the exodus from Egypt, in Hebrew, Yetziat Mitzrayim, literally the emergence from a narrow place. That story forms the theological, ethical, and psychic foundation of the Jewish experience in the world, animating and sustaining our people for thousands of years. It is embedded in our liturgy and our calendar to such an extreme that it is clear that it is designed to affect everything from what we eat to how we pray to our heartache when reading the newspaper every morning. And it stands at the very heart of the teachings of both Dr. Martin Luther King and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and so many others who fought for liberation and redemption, not as political objectives or philosophical abstractions, but as mandates of their faith and moral imperatives. It is at its heart not a story of oppression and enslavement in Egypt. Only a few verses in the first couple of chapters of the book of Exodus describe hundreds of years of debasement and dehumanization. It's also not a story of arrival in the promised land. As the book of Deuteronomy ends, Moses dies on top of a mountain, looking out at but never actually reaching the land of Canaan. Instead, this story is consumed with dreaming of, planning for, and walking toward the promised land. It bears testament to the inextinguishable yearning, both human and divine, for freedom. It focuses on the tedious, protracted, and unfinished process of becoming free from oppression. It is a work in progress, and it endures because the journey from degradation to dignity remains an ongoing struggle to this day. This story, at its heart, establishes the eternal truth of the triumph of freedom over slavery, of dignity over degradation, of liberation over systematized oppression. In a world of cruelty and injustice, this story is a testament to our inextinguishable yearning, human and divine, for freedom, for equity, for equality, for hope in dark times, and for sacred responsibility in times of light and possibility. This is a radical story, and it makes the religious life a perpetual, unfinished moral and spiritual revolution, a testimony to the centrality of human worth and human dignity in a world of human cruelty and degradation, a testimony to the possibility of change in a world of spiritual and political intransigence and stagnation. Which brings us back to today. This story, the story of the Exodus from Egypt, is the most powerful counter-testimony to the politics of hatred that fuel the white supremacist lie that today endangers our communities and sickens our nation. Even as all of our communities are now experiencing profound vulnerability, it is critical that we remember that none of us is alone, that good people everywhere are under attack amid the broader cultural trend of hatred and demonization of minority communities. White supremacy and extremist violence targets Jews, blacks, Muslims, Latinos, LGBTQ folks, immigrants, refugees, and it also targets not only synagogues, but also churches, mosques, Sikh temples, schools, and Walmarts. And they are not only destroying people's lives, but are also threatening to undermine our democracy and to unravel the entire social fabric. So in light of this reality, today we recall the Exodus narrative, and we reaffirm that the only moral choice today is to stand together, to deepen our bonds of connectedness, to work together to overcome the hatred that weakens and ultimately endangers us all, to walk together from darkness to light. The only way to eradicate the cancer in the system is to truly rout it out. As much as there is today a globally networked community of hate on social media, we are called to build globally networked communities of love. We need to stand together, arm in arm, side by side, reclaiming an ethic that fights systemic oppression and treats every single one of us with love, with respect, and with dignity. I am honored to be walking this path with every single one of you. Thank you.
I am truly honored to introduce Pastor Lawson to you this afternoon. He is a hero of the civil rights movement and a leading voice for nonviolence in this world.
If we want to follow and understand what it means to be a Jew or black and a person of love and faith, no two figures can be more significant for our study and reading, and trying to grapple with the things they said and did. Rabbi Heschel joined the 6th campaign of nonviolence in what is better called the Black Freedom Movement, or the Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King struggle for justice. Or as Congressman John Lewis of Atlanta has said, called it the nonviolent movement of the United States of America. And a lot of people don't want to call it that because that may mean that we have to do some serious examination of our own violence, of our own fears. And it might mean that we have to do a serious evaluation of having 800 military bases in more than 100 countries on every continent in our world today. Phenomenon, phenomenal, never before in the history of humankind, so far, much of the history that we know. A nation that claims to be a democratic society that has more than 800 military bases on every continent, in more than 100 countries at this moment, that demonstrates our obsession with self-preservation. It does not reflect a realistic understanding of what we, the people of the USA, require to have a life of stability and security by any means. Now, white supremacy reached perhaps its greatest strength in the 40s and in the 50s. It had the strength of court decisions that year after year across 200 years sustained the status quo in various ways. That included slavery. That included the oppression and radical elimination of native peoples. That included the hanging of women as witches in Salem in 1637. That included understanding that people of color, the Jewish community, in large measure, in the beginning of the nation and to the present moment, were not included in the invitation to find equality and liberty and justice in the United States. The opposition to those desegregations did not yet begin to form. But then with the declaration on the part of the Supreme Court of the United States, a 9-0 decision that racism and segregation in public education is unconstitutional. That is what primarily sowed the seeds for the resistances to truth that we have in the United States today that can be personified by the icon of untruth in the White House today. But I would warn us about that because that icon may be the least of our worries. We perhaps need to be aware of the fact that he's but a little tip at the surface of the iceberg, that we have too many millions of our fellow USA citizens who dabble in that stuff or who have drunk from the wine of that stuff in such a fashion that they really do not understand who they are themselves, and they do not understand who we, the people of the USA, some 300 and nearly 30 million people, who we are. And they clearly do not understand at all the historical documents out of which this democratic experiment began. But again, Heschel and King were both involved in that sixth campaign, which was the Selma to Montgomery March, that sixth major campaign of nonviolent direct action in the United States. I propose quite briefly then to say to us that if we are a gathering for the purpose of trying to promote the change in our city, in our state, in our country, in our world, then I want to propose to you that that nonviolent movement of the United States of America, quoting John Lewis, that must become our model. We must study those different campaigns. We must learn of the people who were there and help to make it happen from 1953 to 1973. And I would say to you that we must adopt as our fundamental spirituality soul force, nonviolence, soul force, spirit force, love force, truth force. All of these being words that Gandhi of India used as he experimented in South Africa and in India with how you bring about change. We've heard in this address from Rabbi Brous how love and compassion have to be at the heart of our spirituality. That's true, but there are various reasons why you and I must give up our playful game with various forms of violence, of speech and fist and ideological. Violence does not allow us to be citizens in a common world, a common place, common nation, common planet. Because violence is always geared to the notion that some people are not worthy of life and therefore should be treated any way we want to treat them because they're not worthy of life. They may have been in the same creation stream of human knowledge, but they are far less than worthy for whatever reason. And therefore they are folk who should be violently handled, violently treated. And we have to have a world of protection where organized war and organized violence are the heartspring and the anchor of our foreign and domestic policies. And if any of us in this room are serious about seeing our country move towards becoming a place where indeed justice does roll like mighty waters, then we'd better be prepared to get rid of our obsession and the propensity of Western civilization to think that every human situation has a military answer or a violent response. And so I simply propose to you that if we are a people gathered here who are genuinely concerned that every form of racism, every form of religious bigotry, every form of reducing human beings to a dot or to a jail cell or to abolition, then I push hard for the kind of spirituality and theology written by Rabbi Heschel and the kind of theology and spirituality that was demonstrated by Martin Luther King Jr. with Rosa Parks and many others becoming the icon for, not the civil rights movement primarily, but for a religious movement, the black church movement, that was for breaking down the walls of hatred and lifting up the walls of truth. Breaking down the barriers of economic crudity and pain and injustice, establishing a society where economic justice can roll like mighty waters. So there can be no seriousness, I maintain, in United States activism or in United States religions if they want to continue to cling to the obsessive violence of our time and to the organized violence of USA, which is a major barrier to the possibilities of a human race that lives up to its creator and its creation. So I commend to you soul force, love force, truth force, God force. So if you haven't considered it, you better begin to consider it, because the things in our nation today, from Trump throughout the various ways in which our nation has done wrong, if we're going to change it and move it and supplant it with a new earth or a new Los Angeles, that which has been created in each other, soul, mind, heart, spirit, joy, must become the tools that enable us to fight the good fight and to win the struggle for a different Los Angeles. I'm convinced that unless the United States of America has a massive nonviolent movement that outstrips anything that any of us did in the 20th century, the human race will not have the chance the Creator offers the race for life and equality.